So my name is Kirk Ellis. I'm a proud member of the Writers Guild. I've been a member of the Guild since 1995, and I've been a professional screenwriter and producer now for the better part of a quarter century. I started my career as a writer, as a journalist working for the trade paper Hollywood Reporter and as a cultural arts reporter for Los Angeles Times. But I majored in film production and what was then called history criticism, now it's called cinema studies, at the University of Southern California. And it was in that capacity that I first met Bud Boettcher, because in 1982, as an undergraduate, as head of the Film Society, it was called a film fraternity, Delta Kappa Alpha, but it wasn't a fraternity, there were just two of us who put on film programs. I helped curate the first comprehensive Bud Boettcher retrospective in the United States. And that was how I got to know him. And through Bud, Burt Kennedy, his screenwriter on these great renowned films that we're talking about, 7 Men From Now, The Tall T, Ride Lonesome, and Comanche Station. And they became early mentors of mine, and they taught me a lot in their individual ways. Bud and Burt were wonderful creative partners, but they were very different personalities. Bud was a very outsized individual. He had the kind of personality that when he was in a room, there was no more oxygen left for anybody else. Most people I knew as a journalist, most celebrities you meet, are quite literally smaller than life. They're shorter, and they don't often have the kind of presence you would expect. Bud was not that. He really was a forceful individual. And you could see that in the films that he made, especially these really independently made westerns through Columbia Pictures with Randolph Scott, where he and Burt were able to do things they couldn't do in a larger budget, more studio-based system. So from them, it was like I had 4 years of film school, then I met Burt and Bud, and I had to unlearn all of those lessons in film school and learn from two masters who had really gone through their full careers and were still working. I mean, Burt Kennedy was still a working screenwriter. Bud was trying to get multiple projects off the ground, and for the better part of 4 years, almost 5 years, I was working with him to try to get a project off the ground that unfortunately never saw the light of day. That breed of filmmaker simply doesn't exist anymore. The word maverick gets tossed around a lot, but these guys really were mavericks. They didn't take a lot of grief from anybody. They easily faced down studio heads, let alone somebody from the middle management development office. But that also made it difficult for them to find their place in the modern system. So I felt really privileged to learn from them, but also it was sometimes heartbreaking to see how difficult it was for them to try to find work that they could really become passionate about. Bud had this reputation of being very autocratic. In other words, that it was my way or the highway. But one of the things about Bud that I didn't really realize until I started doing the research for the Ride Lonesome book was how improvisatory his sets really were. I mean, Bud was not a director who prepped. He didn't have storyboards, which is that thing you hear about. Every young director's got those now. Bud would come out to a location. You know, he was shooting here in Lone Pine, staying at the Dow Hotel just down the street from where we're doing this interview. He would hitch his horse outside. He would ride his horse into the Alabama hills before the crew got there, and he'd look around at that day's work, and he'd figure out roughly what they were going to do, get the actors in place, and see what happened. So he would take suggestions from actors. He would pivot with changing circumstances, but he was in charge. He was definitely in charge of the show. So Bud did a series of westerns between 1956 and 1960, all of them starring Randolph Scott, 4 of them written by Burt Kennedy. Burt created the characters that became known as the characters of the Renown cycle in 1956 with 7 Men From Now. Then they do The Tall T together. Then they do, almost back to back, Ride Lonesome and Comanche Station. Now in between, Bud does two films. He does Decision at Sundown and Buchanan Rides Alone, both written by Charles Lang, that are very different and that are not really part of this focused group of four films where you see Scott play the same character in landscape to landscape. These films are all very much kind of a closed universe that comment on and reflect on each other. And Ride Lonesome was shot in 13 days. The longest schedule of any of those films was 18 days, and you can imagine, how difficult it would be to get films of a certain size and scale done on that limited time frame and a budget of under $500,000. Most of the films cost maybe $350,000. So these were low-budget films that were off the studio radar. And the upside to that was there was no studio interference because, as Bud said, they were literally working, nobody cared about the films. And people thought the Western was dying anyway. But the films, while they may have played double bills, and often these films were on the back half of the double bill, and when you go through some of the advertising for Ride Lonesome, this movie plays against a Lou Costello movie, The Invasion of the 40-Foot Woman, or I'm trying to remember the actual name of the title. We'll come up with it before this is all over. But it was also playing with the Sound and the Fury, a Faulkner adaptation. I mean, they were just thrown on the back of double bills. But they were discovered in Europe. And the first of the films, 7 Men from Now, was reviewed by the dean, the godfather of all the great French film critics who later became directors. His name was André Bazin, and he was a father figure to people like François Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard and Claude Chabrol and all these guys who became influential filmmakers in their own right. He saw 7 Men from Now, and he called it an exemplary Western that was free of psychological mumbo-jumbo, extraneous subplots. It was elemental. And that's what these films were. You have to remember that Bud and Burt made them, think of the period, 56 to 60, really at the height of the Cold War era and the atomic age. And you can look at these films, it's not reading too much into them, to see them as these cautionary tales about existence. They're only, at the most, 4 or 5 characters on a journey through these absolutely desolate landscapes, whether it's the Alancha Dunes south of here, which is an enormous field of white sand, or in some of the craggiest parts of the Alabama hills, these million-year-old rocks. And so they're films about where the Western goes in this age where there is no longer a room for heroism, there's no longer a room for villainy. Everybody's occupying the same limited space, and we're all competing to survive. So sure, with Ride Lonesome, like the films that Burt Kennedy wrote for Bud Boetticher, Burt called them talk treks because he knew, he was a very smart screenwriter, one of the smartest I ever met. He knew what the budgets were. He knew what could, and most importantly, what couldn't be done. So you weren't going to work on this epic frame. You had a limited number of characters, all with Randolph Scott at the center of them, who are on a journey somewhere where it's generally a bounty hunter or somebody bent on a trail of vengeance who comes together and is thrown into a reluctant partnership with the ostensible villain of the piece who is looking to steal the hero's prize. So in Ride Lonesome, you have Randolph Scott as a bounty hunter on the trail of a young outlaw named Billy John, who's played by the wonderful actor James Best, who most people will know from his latter-day work on the Dukes of Hazzard. But James Best came up through the Actors Studio. And really the same year he does Ride Lonesome, he also does a terrific film with Paul Newman called The Left-Handed Gun, which is a very unusual take on the Billy the Kid story. It was Arthur Penn, his very first film in Hollywood, and he will, of course, go on to do Bonnie and Clyde about 10 years later. So James Best is the target, but as Ride Lonesome progresses, you realize he's not so much the target, he is the magnet to attract these other characters who are the real quarry for Randolph Scott. And in Ride Lonesome, Burt takes this whole revenge theme and he puts it on this frame where even the person Randolph Scott is seeking vengeance from is played by Lee Van Cleef. He's forgotten what he even did and has to be reminded of it. It's buried that far back in the past. So the film is really about this whole Western myth that we've all grown up with of the lone hero on the trail of the bad outlaw. Everybody is morally equal in these renowned films, and especially in Ride Lonesome, where you have not one, but two so-called heavies, one played by Pernell Roberts, who will go from Ride Lonesome into Adam Cartwright on Bonanza, and James Coburn as Roberts' sidekick in his very first film. What makes these films so unique in the Western canon, as we call it, is the fact that in many ways the villains are more interesting than Scott's character. And because of the way these villains were cast, Lee Marvin in 7 Men From Now, Richard Boone in The Tall T, Pernell Roberts and James Coburn in Ride Lonesome, finally Claude Akins and Skip Homeyer in Comanche Station, the final film. It's different acting styles. So you get this whole rebel without a cause thing in the Western mode. And it's fascinating to watch that in play with Randolph Scott, who steps up his game at this point. Randolph Scott was an incredibly generous actor. He was self-effacing almost to a fault. One of the stories that Bud never tired of telling was how Randolph Scott, on a film, never read the trade papers. He never read the Hollywood Reporter or Variety. He would always read the Wall Street Journal because he made a killing in real estate and oil wells especially. He was one of the richest men in Hollywood, if not America. So for him, at this point in his career, he is confident enough to cede the spotlight to some of his younger co-stars. And with Lee Marvin, they work wonderfully together. And Lee Marvin's character is so florid with that neck scarf and the prostitute's garter belt that he wears as an armband. And those kinds of things were wonderful catnip for an actor, not only the person playing the heavy, I think his name is Masters, Ben Masters in that film, as it was for Scott, who could relax. As he would always say, let the other fellow do the acting. But on Ride Lonesome, he was taken with James Coburn. And one night here in Lone Pine, could have been at the Totem. I like to think that's where it was, at this wonderful corner steakhouse. Randolph Scott and Bud, and sometimes Bert's part of the story. Bert doesn't remember being there, but he could have been. Randolph Scott said, you know, Bud, who was that young fella in the red underwear that I played a scene with today? He's really good. I said, well, that's a young man named Jimmy Coburn. And Scott said, well, you know, why don't we write him some more lyrics, give him a little bit more to do? And so one of the best scenes in Ride Lonesome, and you'll bring the house down tonight when we show it here in a few hours, Pernell Roberts and James Coburn talking about what they're going to do after they get rid of Randolph Scott, collect James Best, and collect the bounty, which will mean amnesty for them. And it's a remarkably funny scene where Coburn learns in what great esteem Pernell Roberts holds him. And it always brings down the house. And that scene was sent to John Sturgis, who was casting The Magnificent Seven at the time. It was on the basis of that clip that James Coburn was cast in the role that really shot him to stardom. And that's all because Randolph Scott was so generous.
Lee Van Cleef?
Yeah.
Had he done the Clint Eastwood things yet?
No, Lee Van Cleef had not done the Clint Eastwood things at that point. Lee Van Cleef had been one of the heavies, not the chief heavy, but he'd been one of the heavies in High Noon. And he'd been doing second, third banana parts in westerns, gangster pictures, other crime dramas, and things like that. That's right, he was doing, yeah, I mean, Lee Van Cleef was doing B pictures. I mean, High Noon's an A picture, but he's doing, yes, you know, Beast from 10,000 Fathoms, he's doing a lot of genre films. So he does this film, they shot Ride Lonesome in 1958, it's released in 1959. He doesn't go on to those Sergio Leone, Clint Eastwood westerns for another 5 years. But he was, again, one of the people, and he makes Lee Van Cleef doesn't come into Ride Lonesome until the film is almost 2/3 over. But he makes a remarkable entrance. Bud gives him a wonderful sort of ride along in a sweeping crane shot, and he gets off the horse, and you know, they're once again too late to have found Randolph Scott, and that's where Van Cleef's character realizes he's the real target. And Van Cleef really registers there. But it was through those kinds of breakthrough parts that he was able to land that, and it wasn't just with Clint Eastwood. He headlines a whole bunch of films where he plays the character Sabata, and he plays other characters. He has a whole new career in Europe in the 60s. So I'd been looking for a long time. I mean, I say in the acknowledgments to the book that in one way this is a book that's 40 years in the making, because I first saw Ride Lonesome as an undergraduate film student in a class taught by a wonderfully gifted teacher, Richard B. Jewell, who you can hear on commentary tracks for countless westerns, particularly if they were made by RKO. He really wrote the house history of that great studio. And I'd never heard of Bud. And classically, I saw Ride Lonesome on the second half of a double bill in that class with Winchester 73, the great Anthony Mann, Jimmy Stewart film. And I thought, who is Bud? This film was so unique. It was so unlike the westerns that I had seen as an even younger man, and certainly not what would be considered at that point the sort of classic westerns that one has to see before one dies. But I wanted to know more about Bud. So I started watching whatever I could, and this was USC Film School. They had a lot of access to prints and scripts and things, and that gave me the incentive to do the retrospective. Well, I mean, Bud did 3 films about bullfighting. As you know, Bud was a bullfighter in Mexico. He didn't get too far. He got gored fairly early on in his career, but it was as an expert in bullfighting that he came to Hollywood as a technical advisor on the color remake of the movie Blood and Sand with Tyrone Power. And Bud caught the movie bug, and he spent time with the editor of that film, one of the great female editors in early Hollywood. And he said, "Oh, I want to do this for a living." So Bud comes up through the ranks, directing a series of really sort of terrible hour-long B movies, Escape in the Fog, One Mysterious Night, A Guy, a Gal, and a Pal. And he does 10 films as Oscar Bedecker Jr., his real name. But he doesn't change his signature on his films until he makes a movie called The Bullfighter and the Lady with Robert Stack, which was based on his early experience as a bullfighter. And that film was produced for John Wayne's company. And Bud threw his heart and soul into it. And there is a really great example of early 50s personal filmmaking. But it came in at over 2 hours. And Wayne, began to call it the Mexican Nightmare movie. So he had John Ford come in and take 30 minutes out of the film. And that's how it went out. And it went out with the title Torero, with a really cheesy marketing campaign. And Bud felt like he was having to start all over again. But when Bud is doing Ride Lonesome, on the weekends, you have to imagine this, shooting a film for 5 days, on this $350,000 budget. Then on the weekends, he's going to Mexico to film bullfights led by his close personal friend, Carlos Arosa Jr., who was the leading Mexican matador of the time, in the hopes of putting together a movie that will be the sort of greatest movie ever made about bullfighting as a documentary. Bud was conceiving it as what was then very uncommon, a sort of half documentary, half dramatized film. Now, of course, we do that all the time. But it was unique at that point. But Bud, after making Comanche Station, the last of these films in the cycle with Randolph Scott, and one other movie, a terrific gangster picture called The Rise and Fall of Lex Diamond, goes off to Mexico to finish this film and disappears from the industry for 10 years. And that's a whole story we haven't got time to track. But when Bud comes back, the industry's changed completely. And he can't find his place in this new reality of Hollywood. He misses the Beatles. That all happens while he's in Mexico. And there's a now younger crowd in charge. So he's left adrift. But fortunately, this legacy of movies that he leaves in this 4-year period begins to get him the critical attention that eludes him throughout his career in America. Speaking for myself, I became a screenwriter as a result of being a journalist. It was very difficult working particularly as a reporter for the trade papers, for Hollywood Reporter where I worked and for Variety, and not have somebody come up to you once or twice a week, if not 5 times a week, to go, hey, have you ever thought about writing screenplays? No, I really hadn't at that point. I loved I was a film critic. I loved that aspect of it, and in meeting people and learning about how films were crafted, both in classical golden era Hollywood and as they were being crafted when I was a journalist in the 80s. But I got lucky in the sense, I call it a natural cycle of corruption. As I was transitioning out of journalism, the independent film scene, which at that point in time sort of overlapped with the exploitation film scene, the sort of Roger Corman era of filmmaking, I then moved into that realm of things, and I got to love it. So I was going back and forth between magazine work and screenwriting and working on low-budget production for any number of years. But then I've got to think about the chronology here. In 1994, my first feature film was produced and released. It was a movie called The Grass Harp, directed by Charlie Matthau, Walter Matthau's son, starring Walter, Piper Laurie, Sissy Spacek, Jack Lemmon, Joe Don Baker, Roddy McDowall. This really is the sort of who's who of a generation in Hollywood. And not much came of it. Fine Line Features, which had it, sort of threw it out there. But at that point, I transitioned into full-time screenwriting. And I've been lucky in my choices of projects and partners. I did a show for HBO called John Adams back in 2008 with Paul Giamatti as our second president, and Laura Linney as his wife, Abigail, his really remarkable partnership. And that film went on to win 13 Emmy Awards, and I was lucky to win 2 of them. One is as producer of the film, and one is writer of the film. And I've just most recently spent a year in France doing a film for Apple TV that'll be out in the spring of 2024 called Franklin. And it's based on a Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Stacy Schiff about Benjamin Franklin's years in Paris working to win the French alliance. And finally, the treaty with England that won our independence. And that stars Michael Douglas as Benjamin Franklin. I do this feature film, Grass Harp. And that attracts the attention of Francis Ford Coppola, an American zoetrope, his company in San Francisco. When Francis started as a writer, he was in a little corner office at Warner Brothers, what was then called Warner Brothers 7 Arts, and they would give him stuff to write. Here's a book, adapt it. Well, one of the things, of course, that came out of that was the screenplay for Patton, which he co-wrote and won the Oscar for. And Francis was the publisher of a short story magazine that's still in business called Zoetrope All Story. And he would option one story every quarter, and I would do the adaptation of those short stories. So I do 5 of them over the course of about 18 months, 2 years. None of them is ever made, but it attracts the attention. The way you work in Hollywood as a writer is you do work, you meet people, you start working for other people. So I ended up doing a series of biographical projects for ABC in a time when the networks were still doing what we now call long-form miniseries. So over the course of 2 years, you'll love this sort of catalog of projects. I do films about the Beach Boys, the Three Stooges, Judy Garland, and Anne Frank. And the Judy Garland and Anne Frank films are both released the same year and come up for the Emmy Awards.
Was that the Three Stooges movie?
Yeah, it was a 2-hour film for ABC. Yeah, produced by Mel Gibson's company. Yeah, so we did the true story of the Three Stooges, and that was a great project. Michael Chiklis played Curly, and why he was not nominated for an Emmy is beyond me. He was absolutely spectacular. But the Anne Frank film was a real important project for me. I'm very heavily into research for my projects, and that obviously stems from being a journalist. I'll spend 3 times as long researching this project as I will writing it. And in the case of doing Anne Frank, what that meant was spending 3 weeks in Amsterdam, meeting all of Anne Frank's surviving friends, most of them Christian, who had survived the war, and a couple of her Jewish friends as well, and understanding from them what she was really like, getting beyond the diary into the real person. And there was a biography that I was adapting that had attempted to do very successfully the same thing, and I got to work with the writer of that book, who was an Austrian writer, and we collaborated, not as screenwriters, but really talking about what was important in the story. And the Anne Frank film and the Judy Garland film ended up being nominated for the Emmy the same year. It was really kind of remarkable. I wasn't nominated for either one of them, but the Anne Frank film won that year. And that was, the story behind that, by the way, it's important to know, is that the film came out in 2001, and the awards that year were going to be announced. I think they were still doing the Emmys on the Sunday, the Sunday of the second week of September. And we were all in our hotel room on the morning of September 11th, and we all watched the planes hit the Twin Towers. And the Emmy Awards were canceled. They were in fact canceled twice that year. And finally only awarded, I think, the following October. And I wasn't even there for the ceremony at that point. I met at least half a dozen of Anne Frank's friends over the course of that trip, and it was really remarkable what you hear from them. It's like, oh, Anne Frank was a brat, you know, have you heard the story about how she poured molasses on my brother's hair? It's like, oh, and it was a breakthrough. You know, when you do that kind of first-person, physical, on-hand research, you learn those stories. It's like, oh, she was a normal, bratty 13-year-old girl. Let's tell that story. And let's tell it entirely from her point of view and the point of view of her family, and let's see how their world constricts, because our story went before the diary started and the important 18 months after it ended, and they were apprehended by the Gestapo. So we took that story all the way to her death in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And most people don't realize that Anne Frank died just shy of her 16th birthday, 2 weeks before the British liberated that camp. That's how close it was, right? And what I learned from interviewing all those women was that if she had survived, she would have become one of the great Dutch writers of the post-war period. And she probably would have been a journalist, because that's what she was doing. Because even at the time she was apprehended by the Gestapo, she was rewriting her diary for publication after the war. Yeah, no, I was there. I was in her apartment. Her original apartment in the Merveda plane still exists. It was a Bauhaus masterpiece, this sort of you know, a four-sided plaza with these identical buildings on every side. And it's still there. And the annex is still there. It's obviously now it's now the museum. But we rebuilt all of those locations on sound stages in Prague, in the Czech Republic, and we built them to scale, enlarged only so that we could get cameras in there. Shining Light was actually on. It was actually on Nat Geo. Yeah, and that's actually about Miep Hiss, who was one of the people working in Otto Frank's business, who was responsible for making sure the family had everything they needed when they were in hiding. And when I was doing the research trip, and this would have been back in 1999 or 2000, that season, I met Miep. And she was really a remarkable character, because when you meet heroic people, and I do the National Memorial Day concert for PBS that airs every end of May on Memorial Day, or on that weekend. And so I've met Vietnam veterans, I met World War II veterans, I met veterans of the Korean War. When you meet all these people, heroism isn't something that they sort of wear like epaulets on their shoulders. They're very humble about that. And the response is always, in Miep's case, I only did what a good Christian woman at the time would have done. Well, not a lot of people did that, but she did. But that's where true heroism comes from. It's the ordinary person put in an extraordinary circumstance who steps up. And that's really kind of what great storytelling is about as well. Well, so, I mean, it's a really, really tricky balance you have to strike, because I'm not a documentarian. I'm not a photojournalist. I'm a dramatic storyteller. So I tell dramatized history. So no historical subject has a trajectory that is ideally suited for the kind of structure that we use, particularly in American filmmaking, what we call the three-act structure. There's never always a convenient beginning, middle, and end. So we have to look at what are our red lines? What is acceptable for us to change in the actual historical record, and what is not? So you do a story like the story of Anne Frank, that's a whole different level, because unfortunately we still live in a time where people think Anne Frank never existed, the Holocaust never happened, she's a total invention. So you do a story like that, you have to be really careful that everything in the story, even things that you may have invented, you can document. Maybe this didn't happen to her, but we know that she was in this barracks at this concentration camp, and we know what people in that barracks in that concentration camp suffered. You have to be really, really careful. I worked with David McCullough, really America's greatest historian at the time until his unfortunate passing a few years ago, very closely on John Adams. And David was really wonderful because he understood that his task and mine were different. So what he always said was, I understand that you will put John Adams or Abigail Adams in a place they may not have been in history, or you may have to confuse the timeline a little bit to make it work dramatically. I only ask you two things. Make sure that their reaction to whatever situation you put them in is authentic to who they were as people. And don't take them to places they never would have gone. And I've always used that. I mean, the Franklin show, for instance, that I just finished for Apple TV is not 100% historical. We do take some license, particularly with some of his relationships. But the basic parameters of the story, why Franklin goes to France, who he meets, what he does when he gets there, what his personal problems are, that's all true. And often, the things people think I invent are the most historical things in the show. So, yes, and I got a taste of how people sometimes don't know what history is from next door neighbors who would watch some of these biographical projects and leave a note in my door or in my mailbox saying, thank you so much for the show, now I know this story. And I would always get back to them if I knew them and say, please read this book, please read that book, which was a piece of source material for me, because then you will get the real story. I mean, I think some of the things that people, particularly we live in this very divisive time now, where people want to see history as a black or white story. And depending on what side of the fence you're on, your white is somebody else's black and vice versa. But the reason I love history is because it isn't that. It's very complex. It exists in never-ending shades of gray. And so when you're finding a story, it's never the whole story that is worth telling. You want to find this one moment in a life. 8 years where Benjamin Franklin goes to France to seek a treaty, an alliance, and independence. 8 years in this life that goes on for almost 80. That's your story. And so, and even in what we did with Anne Frank, it's not her whole life from birth to early death. It's only these 3 or 4 years that we're telling. So history is complex, it constantly evolves, and we constantly have ways of looking at it. One of the things that makes the Western our greatest genre is that it provided a lens for storytellers, I'm thinking of writers especially, to look at the West, not through the West of the history they're telling, but through the West of the era in which they're writing. The Westerns of the early silent era, which would come closest to what the frontier really looked like because a lot of these people were still around, are very different Westerns from the Westerns of the 1940s, and especially when you get into the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, what you're really looking at is how a new generation is seeing their history. So you're interviewing me here in this remarkable museum, this sort of small but really rich museum of Western history, and particularly Western popular culture, and here in Lone Pine, California. And a lot of these posters are not in English. They're in French or they're in Italian. Some of them are in German, because this particular genre of storytelling came to define America to the world. And it continues to do so even though the practitioners of the art of making Westerns are becoming fewer every year, every month, every day. So the future of the Western has always been up for grabs, but there does seem now to be a new generation of people who want to tell the story, albeit in a very different way. But what's important to preserve all of these artifacts is to really show how much they represent who we are as a people, not only historically, but also through the stories that we tell. Well, it's impossible to write any kind of historical drama and not find a character you identify with. Now, sometimes that's the main character, because that's how you have to go through it. Sometimes, though, your entry into the character may be a supporting character who you're using, who introduces you as an individual, as a writer, into this world. But again, there's a phrase that David McCullough taught me called, in the research phase, you have to do something called marinating your head, which means you read everything you can. If there's visual culture, you look at everything you can. And it's not just about who these people were. You read what they wrote. You also read what they read. You look at what they looked at, so that you become immersed in this world. Now, sometimes these are painful places to go. It was very difficult to write the last third of the Anne Frank script because I could only be in that world of blackness and death for a couple of hours a day. I had to go somewhere else. I had to see a film, had to take a walk. I couldn't write at the same level of intensity I could do the other part of the story. And I think the mistake that people writing history, whether we're talking about book authors or screenwriters, make is that you want to write about a theme. And that's huge, it's broad. You can't make a reader or a viewer identify with a theme. You have to find a character. You can't write a movie about slavery, but you can do a movie like 12 Years a Slave, which follows one person's journey through that awful period. And so that's what you have to find. You have to find that individual, because stories are about people, and you have to tell a story that you want to tell and that you live with for the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. I'll give you an example. I did a show as supervising producer and writer back in 2005 for TNT called Into the West, which is really about the westward expansion movement, what we call, on our side of the equation, manifest destiny. Native Americans have a different, less complimentary theme for that, word for it. But that's not what the story's about. The story is about two families, one Anglo, one Native American, whose paths cross over the course of the 60 years of westward expansion from 1820 to the Wounded Knee atrocity in 1890. So, but it starts with the characters, it starts with the story. And then you build everything out from that. So my book, Ride Lonesome, was one of the first two books to come out in a series called Real West, and that's R-E-E-L, West, published by the University of New Mexico Press. And they are looking at a complete series of about 6 books that will come out between now and the end of 2026. So you can find, the book is available online. You can also find it through the UNM Press website. You can certainly find it on Amazon, but I would encourage people, because it's an academic press, and academic press are doing some of the most adventurous publishing in the country now, I would encourage them to go to the University of New Mexico Press website, which is easily found online. I'm embarrassed to say that this is the first time I've been to this festival, which is now in its 33rd year, and it's only the second time I've been to Lone Pine, the first time when I was doing research for the book back in the spring of 2021. But I've heard about this festival for 15, 20 years, about what a real gem it is, and now I've seen it. This is only my first day and a half here, and it's been really remarkable. This is a place where you write a book like Ride Lonesome, and people don't come to your table and go, hey, what's your book about? They know what the book's about. They're interested in your take on the movie, and if they like it, they'll buy the book, and that's so refreshing. People here they love the area. They love the history of the area, not just for its Western history, but its geological history and its early history, and because of what it represents. Yes, I mean, I did, when I did the research for the Ride Lonesome book in 2021, I was up and down these hills looking specifically, obviously, for the locations in Ride Lonesome and the other renowned films that Bud and Burt did together, and found them all. But then, you know, I don't think a lot of people appreciate this wasn't just the West. This was the Imperial British East in films like Charge of the Light Brigade and Lives of a Bengal Lancer and Gunga Din especially. That's what's so wonderful, is that how these rocks had many, many uses. A lot of movies are about cowboys, and I put cowboys in air quotes, but there are only a handful of movies about how cowboys actually used to live. And of those movies, and I mean, I can think of maybe 5 of them, the best one is Will Penny, the great film written and directed by Tom Grise, starring Charlton Heston and Joan Hackett. And really, that film is all about Heston and Hackett. You've got this remarkable group of character actors. You've got Slim Pickens, you've got G.D. Spradlin, I mean, it goes on, who are only in the first 10 or 15 minutes of the film. And then it really becomes what an incredibly lonely life it was for these cowboys working the line of the fences, especially in the winter. No, that is a really, really terrific Western. I get asked a lot about the value of historical accuracy in the movies I work on. But let's further boil that down. The benefit of historical accuracy in Westerns. You talk to anybody walking through this museum right now or any other time, and they will tell you that their favorite movie about the OK Corral is Tombstone, which is not a good film, but it is historically accurate. Now, if I had to pick an OK Corral film, I would pick My Darling Clementine, the John Ford film with Henry Fonda and Victor Mature, which is about as far from the historical fact of the so-called OK Corral gun battle as can be. But as a movie, it's phenomenal. It's terrific. So I don't judge movies based on their accuracy. I base them on whether they get true to the spirit of the piece. Because that's all we can really do as writers. We're never going to be, we weren't there. Neither were the people who made Tombstone. The only people who know what really happened there, they're all dead. And even their own memories got clouded over time or deliberately brought up to where they had more to do than what they really did. So, I'm always looking at what captures the essence of the time. If there was one way to tell a story, historically, there'd be one book about John Adams, or about Wyatt Earp, or about Billy the Kid. But as we know, there are literally library shelves full of books about famous outlaws in the West, famous gunfighters. So everybody's telling a different story. And every story they're telling themselves is the right one. But there is no right story. My favorite Custer film is actually Fort Apache, which isn't about the Little Bighorn, but it is the Little Bighorn story told in the Southwest with Henry Fonda's character as a Custer stand-in. So, and that movie, even though it's not about Custer, is more accurate about Custer than any other Custer film. Oh, I saw the elephant. That sort of famous phrase, I think it's mostly associated with people who went west with grand ambitions only to find them all completely shattered by the realities they found. They saw the elephant. Yeah, I think I first heard that phrase in the long miniseries version. I think it was a 12 or 24 episode version of the James Michener novel Centennial. And one of the episodes was called Seeing the Elephant. And as a high school student, I had to find out what that meant. And I should point out that I'm not a Civil War historian, but I'm actually, but I'm actually researching a book right now that deals with the outlaw mystique and the role of guns in American society. And what the Civil War does is it floods the frontier with readily available firearms. And not only that, but with a group of young males who know how to use them, who get sort of reimagined in American popular culture as gunslingers. But Jesse James was a bushwhacker as a teenager on the Kansas-Missouri borderlands, and these are cold stone killers. And so the Civil War's effect on the West is to really ramp up the level of violence that we see on the frontier. Well, yeah, the thing about armed combat in that time, you're talking about the Patriot, and that's actually the Revolutionary War. But when you're talking about the Civil War, and I walked some of those battlefields, we shot John Adams in Virginia, outside of Richmond, a place called Mechanicsville, which was, of course, a Civil War battlefield itself. And when you walk the lines, they are like literally looking at each other. And it's, even given the level of carnage, you're talking about 1/3 of the adult male population was wiped out in the Civil War. The weapons they were using were remarkably inaccurate. So even in close quarters, they can miss or they can misfire. But if you imagine what that would look like now with our weaponry, it just would be mass slaughter. One of the biggest problems with the genre is that it was telling the story from one singular, unique point of view, the sort of white male conquering point of view. And we're now living in a time when people who were marginalized in the story of the West are now telling their stories, whether that's women, Hispanics, but particularly Native Americans. And Native American filmmakers are really looking at the West in a different way. And the West they're looking at isn't the historical West. They're looking at the West in the way they live it now. So, in my opinion, the best show to come across the airwaves in a long time just ended its 3rd season. It's called Reservation Dogs, written by Sterling Harjo, one of the great Native American writers and filmmakers. And that's really about young natives finding their way in this culture where it's increasingly difficult to walk in both worlds. So I find that future of the Western really exciting because we're going to start to see stories. Yeah, I mean, they're not going to be made at the sheer numerical level that they were made in the past, but the stories are going to be ever more unique. The strike was really, the Writers Guild strike that just ended, you know, just a couple weeks before we're doing this interview here in October, I think was a wake-up call for a lot of us because the industry is going to consolidate. Regardless of whatever terms we achieved, and we achieved a really historic contract, there's not going to be as much work for as many of us as there has been in the past. So we need to look at what our other options are. And one of the things I love about doing books of socio-historic research, like Ride Lonesome in this new book I'm writing now, which uses Bonnie and Clyde, the filming of Bonnie and Clyde, as a way to get into this whole outlaw mystique and its hold on American culture, is that I'm in charge of it all. It's my book. Yes, there's an editor, yes, there's a publisher, and they weigh in at the time, but while I'm working on it, until I meet my word count and turn it over, it's my baby. And that's been really liberating. Now, you can't get rich writing a book, even if you're Stephen King these days. It's really tricky.
So Kindle's not going to do it.
No, it's not going to do it. Yeah, it's not going to do it. And streaming isn't going to do it for us. We don't, writers, until the strike, until the resolution, we weren't making any money from anything on streaming. If you watched the show on streaming, the only money that writers got for it was what we were paid to write it. That's it.